I would now like to welcome the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, the Honourable Greg Piper, who is going to introduce the lecture. Over to you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Legislative Assembly of the New South Wales Parliament. I recognise a few faces in here. Is there anybody here it's their first time to this chamber? Well, welcome. And I say that because I like to point out that you are in the chamber of the oldest parliament in Australia. This was firstly the chamber of a legislative council until the establishment of a legislative assembly in 1856. But this is such a historic place where we're meeting here today to talk about such matters. And it's always wonderful to be able to welcome people here to this and point to the other room here, the Wentworth room, which is the site where the very first parliament in Australia sat. So you're in a very significant, historically significant location. I shall acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional owners of lands on which we meet. I wish to acknowledge the traditional owners and thank them for their custodianship of country. So there's many special guests here, I know, so we'll just take it as a given that you're all special guests. I note we have members of the Legislative Council. It's wonderful to see you here. I'm not sure if there are any other members of Parliament, but the Honourable Nicole Overall has joined us from the Legislative Council. There's a number of staff from around the building, but for all those who are guests to the area, to the Parliament, thank you. Just as Chris was saying, as you leave here, you'll see a couple of photos out there mounted on the back of this wall. The first one will be of George Braund. Then after that will be the gravesite of George Braund, and then Edward Larkin. When I have the opportunity to show anybody through this area, and particularly into my office, I always stop them, and that's including international visitors from out of state, or just anybody who's in the area. But if they've got a moment, I like them to stop and reflect, as I often do, on what I call the Hall of Heroes. I have only two of them there, and they're being represented there because of the memorialisation of those two members, not because they were the only members that stepped up to serve. But what I'd say to people is that at the outbreak of war, World War I, there could be no place of higher privilege for a white man than to be in the New South Wales Parliament, in either house, but particularly the Legislative Assembly. For any member of this house to then step aside from the safety afforded them by this position of privilege they have in here was an extraordinary thing. Braund and Larkin, of course, we remember particularly because of the sacrifice they gave. It was my predecessor, the Honourable Richard Dennis Marr, who I'd never had the pleasure of meeting, who on August the 11th, 1915, ordered the bronze plaque to be cast in memory of our deceased gallant comrades. I see Mr Marr is the third from the right in that rosette up there. I was looking for him myself. I hadn't looked at any of the writings or the Hansard record of Dennis Marr, Richard Dennis Marr, but as we go through you'll hear some of his words. Marr recruited the Sydney-based artist James Castle to create this plaque here on this wall in this chamber. And Castle was renowned throughout the country for his bronze work as the best in the land. It was less than 3 months after the commissioning that Castle's bronze tribute was unveiled on November 30th, 1915. when Braund, the then member for Armidale, and Larkin, the then member for Willoughby, enlisted to fight abroad, Speaker Marr told the House on September 8, 1914, that we know Lieutenant Colonel Braund and Sergeant Larkin will fight like Australians and, if need be, die like Australians. But we pray Providence will spare them both to return to the sunny soil which gave them birth. Their pursuit of freedom for their countrymen back home decreed otherwise. They weren't the only sitting members of the New South Wales Parliament to serve in the war, but Nathan will be telling you more about that very shortly. Marr made another salient declaration when he unveiled that plaque, which was, "Let me say, when we have passed away and other legislators sit in this honourable chamber, controlling the destinies of millions of happy and liberty-loving citizens, this bronze memorial will be a record of the fealty and affection of this far-flung part of the empire in the dark days of Britain's storm and stress." And here we are, 110 years later, doing exactly that. Before I introduce Nathan, I want to thank him for his work and his commitment to not just preserving but enhancing our undying commitment to upholding the honour of those who fought and sometimes gave their lives so that our freedom lived on and that the very pillars of our free democracy remain untethered in this very place where laws are made. Just as a personal aside, can I say we might not all agree with the sentiment that was expressed by the Speaker at the time of the reasons why people thought that they should give up their seats and join in the expeditionary forces to another country to fight people they'd never met. We might have different views about that, but we need to look at these people through the lens of the time. And through the lens of the time, I look at people in this place who are not unlike any other member who has come through here over these many years, who, if asked, I am sure the vast majority would also, hopefully, and I believe would, step up. Politicians in this place, while in a privileged position, are just members of their community. And so often that's not recognised. With Braund and Larkin, we cannot miss that message that they were flesh and blood, human beings, members of their community, and they gave it all for what they believed in. I will say Nathan started a research project over a year ago to honour those who serve their local communities in this place, and Nathan serves this house likewise and helps members of the Parliament perform their duties. And Nathan, I wish to thank you for everything you've done, and I shall now hand over to you to talk about those who have served as members of Parliament and served in times of war. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I just add my own thank you to you all for coming here this afternoon, and what a great privilege and honour it is to be able to speak in this historic chamber as well. Hopefully you've been able to pick up one of these booklets on the way in. If not, we can get you one on the way out as well, but it gives a small amount of detail of the lives of the people that we're about to be looking at this afternoon. If you'll allow me a brief indulgence though, I thought that I might actually start things off by mentioning this gentleman, or these two gentlemen up on the screen here. The man on the left is Lance Corporal Emerson Anderson, who is my great-grandfather. He served in the First World War. He enlisted on the 9th of February 1916, and he served with the 53rd Battalion. He also won the Military Medal in 1918 for conspicuous gallantry as a signalman in Molencourt in northern France. His son, John William Anderson, is to his right. He actually got married during the Second World War, so that is my granddad and nan on the screen there as well. He served in the Second World War. He enlisted in 1941 in October, serving as a corporal in the 11th Division. Less of a positive experience. He did consider it the nadir of his life. It was probably one of the worst elements of his life, but he still served his nation. It's perhaps because of these two men that history is something that's always fascinated me. particularly the First and Second World Wars. In particular, I was a high school history teacher before joining here. But what these men and their families were willing to sacrifice in pursuit of a noble goal is just fascinating to me. John's son Ian, my dad, is also here today, and had neither of these men survived, neither of us would be here to share in this occasion. So it is a privilege to truly be here. But with that indulgence aside, we'll head on to the rest of our presentation here. And before we get into the service of these 11 members, I thought it would be quite useful to understand a bit of the context of what's happening in the society at the time of the early 1910s to really wrap our heads around and understand where we get to when the war starts. In 1910, we see the election of the very first Labor government in New South Wales under James McGowan. He'd led the party since 1894, so 16 years for him to lead the party finally into government at that time. He defeated Charles Wade of the Liberal Reform Party. He'd been Premier for the previous 3 years before then. And while it was a historic victory for Labor, it did herald in about 20 years of quite tumultuous political timings. It's quite an unstable era into the 1930s. And McGowan faces a challenge almost immediately upon becoming Premier. It's in 1911 he's overseas to actually commemorate the coronation of King George V, and his deputy, Mr Holman, has quite a bit of trouble on his hands. Now, Billy Dunn, he's one of the gentlemen we'll be looking at shortly this afternoon. He's also elected in 1910 for the Labor Party, yet within a year resigns from the party, and there's a by-election triggered within that first year of forming government. Dunn was a fierce opponent of a land policy from his own government that was being heralded. It would have allowed leaseholders on Crown land to convert to freehold tenure, and it was deeply unpopular with a lot of our country members, Dunn being the member for Mudgee. So the resignations of Dunn and Henry Horne, who was the member for Liverpool Plains, again another regional seat, it left the acting Premier Holman utterly dumbfounded, particularly when he discovered that the pair had already handed in their resignations to the Speaker. At the time, the opposition leader, Charles Wade, he is moving a censure motion condemning this piece of legislation, this change that's meant to come in. The government is without a clear majority, and they narrowly avoid defeat at 4:30 a.m. on the 26th of July 1911. They've been going all through the night. I'm sure Mr Speaker can appreciate those late mornings as well. Unbeknownst to the acting Premier, Dunn and Horne had arranged voting pairs. The government received the support of 2 independents, and a couple of opposition members were absent at the time. However, the occasion became a little farcical when Mr Varney Parkes, member for Canterbury, son of Sir Henry, of course, he explained that he'd intended to vote with the opposition, but he'd actually fallen asleep on this side of the chamber and such had his vote counted on this side, as it happened to be. But regardless, amidst calls to resign, the Deputy Premier, or the relieving Premier Holman, rushes to Government House to get rid of, or to resign the ministry before the House can vote in no confidence, and we get to this by-election with Billy Dunn. Curiously, the Mudgee by-election is won by Billy Dunn for the Labor Party. So he resigns from the Labor Party to trigger the by-election and wins it for the exact same party which he's just resigned from. The only change is that the repealing of this legislation had changed by a couple of months, but Dunn was still just as hostile to this platform as ever before, but it was quite clear that Labor needed him in their party to form government. He wins the by-election by 198 votes. Similarly with Liverpool Plains, they win that again, but it again just speaks to this fairly unstable start to this McGowan government. McGowan's days are numbered in many respects as well. He gets to 1913, but there is a gas workers' strike at the time. Perhaps unwisely, McGowan attempts to settle the dispute by warning all of these gas workers that he'll replace them with free workers to take their jobs, which kind of goes against the grain of his entire political career and is deeply unpopular. He resigns only a few days later. Mr Holman had been in England at the time he returns, and only 6 days after his return is that resignation of the Premier, but Holman becomes the new party leader and, in effect, the Premier of New South Wales. Within 6 months, we go to an election. Now, we could spend a lot of time unpacking this election itself. There's probably a lecture alone in the 1913 election, but in particular, the people I want to focus on are those 11 members of Parliament who end up going to serve with the AIF. So Holman was against Charles Wade, still leader of the Liberal Reform Party in opposition. Labor for Holman being the member for Cootamundra, and Wade the member for Gordon. So again, a bit of a city versus country appeal as well. Another matter of interest at this election is we see the rise of the Farmers and the Settlers Party. It's a party that is formed to look after the interests of rural constituents at the time. It was felt that, particularly in the country, those city members didn't really understand the needs and what was important to those in rural areas. This party, the Farmers and Settlers, is soon to become the National Party as well. Liberal Reform, they sort of largely endorse the Farmers and Settlers, so they effectively enter into a coalition. But as we'll see, Labor still wins this fairly comfortably, despite a bit of a swing against them. So there's about a 2% swing against Labor in the total vote. They still pick up 3 seats. Looks bad for the Liberal Reform Party losing 9 seats in that large swing, but again, they don't run a few candidates in those rural seats which are won by the Farmers and Settlers. So we can really see that coalition gained 1 seat and probably about 1 or 2% above their regular vote. It's also important to note at the time voting is not compulsory, so you do see large jumps back and forth in different elections depending on how much of the population is roused by what's going on as well and the issues that are important to them. And the only other note is that we have 3 independents who pick up a couple of seats as well. But as I said, we're going to focus particularly on these members that go off to serve in the war, elected in this one. So we'll start off with our Labor candidates, the first of whom being Ambrose Campbell Carmichael. Often goes by Campbell Carmichael, later Captain Carr. He has held the seat since 1907, so a bit of a stalwart already as the member for Leichhardt. He's actually born in Hobart, studies a bit of law and accounting in his earlier days. By his 4th year as a Member of Parliament, he's a Minister for Public Instruction, Labour and Industry. He then quits the Cabinet over a few issues of precedence, but they lure him back and add on Colonial Treasurer in 1912 as well, which he seems quite pleased with. The second we have is William Fraser Dunn, Billy Dunn, as we've already heard a bit about before. I chose this photo in particular because he was a member for such a long time. I think he just needed to lie down by the end of it. It's nearly 40 years in total that he's the member. But he's elected for about the 3rd time in as many years. So he's elected in 1910, then the by-election, then 1913. So he's pretty experienced at elections in such a short time either way. The third man we have here is Charles Stewart Fern. He's a miner at Urandery. He's about 18 years old when he starts there in 1903. He becomes quite involved, particularly with the unions. He makes a bit of trouble with his boss. His boss doesn't really like him because he keeps advocating for the workers, trying to get some better working conditions for them. And over about 6 or 7 years, he becomes quite a popular man in that region. He actually contracts tuberculosis for all of his troubles in working with the mines as well. He's elected in a 1911 by-election for the rural seat of Cobar, another pretty strong mining town there as well. And the fourth Labor man we have here is Edward Rennix Larkin. Ted Larkin, as he was also known, Mr Speaker earlier spoke a bit about Mr Larkin's exploits. But in his earlier life, he was the son of a quarryman out in the coal mining town of Lambton, just near Newcastle. Lambton also happened to be one of the first towns in the Newcastle district to get electricity in the late 1890s as well. He then comes to Sydney on a scholarship with St Joseph's College, where he begins to play rugby. By 1903, Larkin is the captain of Newtown's first grade rugby union team. It's a side that is widely cheered for its style of play and attractive play, and he soon gets selected for New South Wales. Before he plays his very first game for New South Wales, though, he gets married the day before his debut. So he's got a very understanding wife who allows him to play the next day for New South Wales, and it's against the New Zealand rugby league team as well. They lose 3-0 in reportedly a very wet and soggy match, but they get through it. But it's a wonderful year for Larkin because in that same year of 1903, he also represents the Australian rugby union side, the Wallabies as we would now know it. It's also in their first test match against New Zealand, or what is now the Bledisloe Cup. They fared just as well as we do in recent Bledisloe. They lost fairly comfortably against New Zealand, but that is the extent of his rugby union career, just that one match. He then becomes a foot constable with the New South Wales Police. Again, quite a popular member of staff. People come to know him quite well, but eventually resigns from that position because he gets quite involved in Labor politics, and his bosses don't like this idea of a policeman getting involved in politics, so he resigns, gets really deep in there. 1908, if you're a rugby league fan, that might be a year familiar to you. Our dear friend Ted is part of that breakaway competition, the New South Wales Rugby League. He becomes its very first full-time secretary soon after, and is largely credited with the success of the league in its early days. It's said that without Ted Larkin, what we would now know as the NRL probably wouldn't have survived or has been as popular in those early days. And I believe even at headquarters now, they've got a portrait of Larkin still up in their building. The other interesting thing about Larkin at this election in particular is that he becomes the very first Labor member to be elected to a North Sydney seat, usually quite an affluent area. Even back then, it's rare for a Labor member to really get hold of the population there. So he wins the seat of Willoughby. Now we flick over to the Liberal Reform Party, slightly different to our now Liberal Party. They are slightly different ideas. Another rugby man here left of the screen is George Frederick Braund. He's the member for Armidale. Also elected for the very first time in 1913. In his earlier days, back in 1888, he makes his debut for a New South Wales side against a touring English team. It's a 21-man squad organised by the English cricketers James Lillywhite, Alfred Shaw and Arthur Shrewsbury. The 22-year-old George Braund was selected in the third and final match, effectively to fill up the numbers, the newspaper reports say at the time. Soundly defeated again, but another great honour for him. Had he been of a younger age, he may have been alongside Ted Larkin in the early 1900s in some of those sides. But his father, Frederick, hailed from England. Braund himself was born in Bideford, Devonshire, and he passed an entrance exam to Oxford, but unfortunately for him, his father decided to move the family to Australia, so he never got to realise those dreams of study over in Oxford. He was only 16 years old at the time. But Frederick, he opens up a pretty successful business out in Armidale, Braund & Co., and upon his death, George and his brothers helped to take over that business and again become quite popular in the local area. And Braund's pretty easily elected for the Liberal Reform Party in 1913. After that, we've got Thomas Henley, the member for Burwood, also another Englishman born in Wootton Bassett in Wiltshire. In 1860, he's a farm hand and plasterer in his younger days. And in his early 20s, he migrates to Sydney, continues to work as a plasterer before joining councils and a few other things. He's elected to the Drummoyne Municipal Council and serves as mayor in 1900. And he's first elected to the Assembly in 1904, as we'll see on the screen there too. So he's the earliest serving of the members that we do have. His platform for the 1913 election was against the heavy taxation that citizens faced at the time as well. He himself has built up a pretty handy property portfolio, so he's probably got some interest in those matters as well. But again, a very long-standing member for the Liberal Reform Party. Now, we'll see Charles Edward Nicholson here, and just before I get to Mr Nicholson, I made an observation by this point, and that was that all the Liberal Reform members had moustaches, and that all of the Labor members were completely clean-shaven. I don't know if that speaks to any political affiliation, but it was an interesting observation nonetheless, as it happened to be. But Nicholson, he's in a razor-thin seat of Maitland. He wins it by only 97 votes. Before then, he'd spent some time as a law clerk in Maitland. He's appointed a Crown Land agent with the Lands Department, spends a good 7 or 8 years out at Coonabarabran before returning closer to home to look after his ailing father, who soon passes away. Nicholson's a bit of a career military man, though. As early as 1888, he is serving with the New South Wales Lancers. He also sees action in the Boer War. He is mentioned in dispatches on 3 separate occasions, so distinguishes himself quite well on the battlefield at the time. Enters the conflict as a lieutenant, but soon rises through the ranks as well. When he's first elected in the 1911 by-election, he wins that by 799 votes, a bit more comfortably. And there was a report at the time from one lady who was asked who she voted for, and she said she didn't really know if she was in favour of the Liberal or the Labor policy, but she knew one thing, and that was that she intended to vote for Major Nicholson. So it didn't matter for party for her, it was the person that was very important. And it's a surname now that we might be a little familiar with. This is James William MacArthur Onslow. He's the member for Bondi. He wins first in 1907. He wins Waverley as an independent Liberal. He essentially fights against the Liberal Reform candidate basically on the exact same platform, just in slight differences, and the people choose James here. He sees 9 months of service in the Second Boer War as well, and he's the great-grandson of John MacArthur, a great pioneer of the merino wool industry and largely responsible for the Rum Rebellion. We are, of course, in the Rum Hospital, or remnant of, so a slight connection there. The interesting thing about Mr Onslow here is that he's happy to vote on principle ahead of party. If he thinks that something is so important to him, he will go against his party and vote with his convictions. In 1910, he faces quite a vehement smear campaign from people in his electorate as well, but he still oversees it. It's a pretty comfortable seat for the party, and people do like him. He's also very critical of the Labor government at the time. He refers to McGowan and Holman's government as a sod-turning government who were so prolific of promises and so barren of accomplishment. But that moves us along to our sole farmer and settler, Mr Chaffey here. Frank Chaffey is a member for Tamworth. He defeats the father of the house, the longest-serving member, Robert Levian, who had spent 33 years in this very chamber here. That is 8 years longer than Chaffey had been alive. He becomes what is known as the baby of the house, our youngest member of Parliament, and as a 25-year-old agriculturalist, he's described as a bushman born and bred. His father William arrived in Australia as a 17-year-old. It's said that all he had was 16 shillings in his pocket. And he goes on to follow the usual life of a bushman in those times, working various jobs. But Frank, his son, he enrolls at the Hawkesbury Agricultural College at only 16 years of age. He excels there. He places first in several different subjects. He places second overall in the list of merit as well. He works with his brothers for about a year and a half, and he goes back to the Sydney Technical College to study a bit more about agriculture. He then goes wool classing. He studies different parts of New South Wales, tries to understand the different ways in which farmers operate at the time as well. And he learns quite a lot before returning home to Tamworth, going into business with his brothers in the very famous Chaffey Brothers business, as it's known at the time. It's on the Naminga estate, which his father had first bought in the early 1900s. Chaffey himself also has a bit of a military background. He's part of the 5th New England Light Horse Regiment, and by 1913 he'd been upgraded to second lieutenant just before the war starts as well. So again, quite well-regarded citizen at the time. But just a year after this election takes place, or even less within a shorter period of time, we see the outbreak of the First World War, the Great War, as it's known at the time. Now, I won't, of course, go into too much detail. I'd expect most of us to understand the nature of World War I and how it starts, of course. But we do have this image here to help jog our memories a little bit, perhaps if we've forgotten some of the key details. We've got heir presumptive to the Austro-Hungarian throne, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. They are visiting Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914, he and his wife Sophie. A couple of years earlier, his kingdom had annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. They'd already occupied it for about 40 years, but then decided to annex it, go that step further. So there's quite a few tensions, as you can imagine. We then have a group called the Young Bosnians. There's 6 of them, a group of terrorists who are looking to assassinate the Archduke. Largely speaking, most of them miss their aims. They're a bit forlorn. Poor old Gavrilo Princip's walking down the street thinking he's missed his chance. But then, as it happens, the car takes a wrong turn, there's a bit of a detour, and Princip fires 2 shots, killing the Archduke and his wife Sophie, as has been dramatised in the image in front of us. 10 demands are then issued to Serbia from Austria-Hungary. About a month later, war is declared, the alliances form. On the 4th of August, Germany invades Belgium, and all of a sudden Britain declares war of Germany. Australia is also at war. We see this big tangled web of alliances, which effectively ends up with Australia fighting in Gallipoli against the Ottoman Empire for a Serbian killing an Austrian. It's the nature of the war in its early days. Within a week of war being declared by Australia, George Frederick Braund had enlisted for active service at the age of 48. He becomes the first parliamentarian in the entire country to enlist for active service as a Member of Parliament. He's been a military man since 1893. He's risen through the ranks to Lieutenant Colonel by 1913. A year earlier, he'd been appointed to command the 14th Hunter River Infantry. And upon enlisting in 1914, Braund was appointed by Colonel Henry McLaurin to raise and train the 2nd Battalion of the 1st Australian Imperial Forces. Braund in Armidale receives a farewell unexampled for enthusiasm in the annals of Armidale that said that thousands of people sang patriotic songs and cheered for him as he left the streets of Armidale for Sydney. Only a few days later, Ted Larkin also enlists at the age of 34. J.C. Davis, one of the well-regarded sports journalists at the time, had his own newspaper. He wrote that Larkin goes as a private, being a family man, Mr. Larkin shows a very high order of patriotism. Though his hair is white, ERL is but a young man. And the Catholic press also wrote of Larkin that his enlistment in the expeditionary forces not surprised those who are familiar with his well set up figure and elastic step, of course referring back to his former rugby days as well. Both men are farewelled in the Legislative Assembly. The Speaker at the time, Speaker Maher, as the Speaker here referred to earlier, said that we know that both Lieutenant Colonel Braund and Sergeant Larkin will fight like Australians and if need be die like Australians. But we pray that Providence will spare them to return to this sunny soil that gave both of them birth. The Premier added along to this, he said that there had been no previous occasion in the history of the New South Wales Parliament when one or more of its members left while the chamber was in session to engage in actual warfare. It therefore devolved upon the House to mark in some proper fashion its deep and sincere sense of admiration at their action. And both men, Braund was gifted a pair of field glasses, whereas Mr. Larkin was gifted a gold watch, both in appreciation of their fellow parliamentarians for the service that they're about to embark upon. And it's at this point I will just note, we're fortunate to have a few of our Legislative Council staff and members in the chamber. There are two members of the Legislative Council who actually enlist to serve at a similar point as well. We've got Dr. John Brady Nash, who'd been appointed in 1900. It's life appointments in the Legislative Council at the time. And also Dr. Joseph Livesey Beeston. He goes off and serves. He was appointed in 1908. Both men serve in a medical capacity. Beeston actually writes a memoir of his time at Anzac called 5 Months of Anzac. If you can track down a copy, it's a very fascinating read as well. And Dr. Nash has got some letters in the State Library which are quite eye-opening in understanding the experience of the war as well. It's a slight aside, but he mentions that the bullets used by the Turks were quite humane at the time, which wasn't much of sympathy to those grieving back home, but in the sense that the men didn't suffer at the very least. But it's an interesting letter to read, particularly in the context of everything else. Now, after these men have set off from the chamber to go and serve in war, we do have a couple of interesting additions to our parliament here. So in late 1914 and early 1915, there's two very consequential by-elections that take place with a couple of additional members here. To our left, we have George Cairn, the member for Canterbury when he comes in. He came to Australia as a 29-year-old and he found work in the coalfields around Lithgow initially. Similarly, he gets quite involved in the Miners' Union. In 1905, he becomes president of the Western Miners' Association and he becomes an alderman on Lithgow City Council as well. Before he's come to our Legislative Assembly, though, he's actually spent time in the House of Representatives. In 1910, he's elected to the federal seat of Nepean. There's a 12% swing against the incumbent Eric Bowden to help Cairn win by 652 votes. And particularly what enamoured him to the people was that he campaigned on a progressive land tax, which would break up these big estates and allow more people to settle on the land at the time. However, in 1912, there is a redistribution of electoral boundaries federally, which is described as a case of horror on horror's head for George Cairn. Just about every area that you wouldn't want to be redistributed to you is, and as a result, he loses the 1913 election by over 3,000 votes. A couple of months later, he then contests the state election as trying to become the member for Upper Hunter against Mac Abbott and Henry Willis. Again, this is a slight tangent, but it's very interestingly contextually. It's essentially a contest for the most speaker-adjacent seat in 1913 in Upper Hunter. George's brother John Cairn had been Speaker in 1910. His name is also up just behind me here. He leaves the Speaker's role in 1911 with the resignation of Billy Dunn that I mentioned before. We also have Mac Abbott. His father, Sir Joseph Abbott, was the Speaker in 1890 to 1900, at the time the longest serving continuous Speaker. There's also a large portrait of him in Speaker's Square, which you might be able to see on the way out. And finally, we have Henry Willis, who's quite a controversial Speaker in 1911. He replaces Cairn's brother. And this is where the story gets a little bit interesting for me. So again, please indulge me, but I hope you'll find it's worth it. In 1911, when they are electing a new Speaker, it is quite controversial. The selection itself was marred by constant interjections and even threats of physical violence in the chamber. Now, Willis, he was a member of the Liberal Reform Party. Because Labor's position was quite precarious in government, they didn't want to have a member for themselves as Speaker. Willis, as not realising it's a bit of a poisoned chalice, thinks that he can come into the Speaker's role. He wants it to be a bit like the Westminster tradition in the sense that he revokes his own party, no one's going to contest him at an election. He can be a truly independent Speaker in that sense. Labor already doesn't like him because he's from the Liberal Reform Party, and because he tries to become more independent, the Liberal Reform Party don't really like him either. So there's a bit of contention there. In the actual selection of all of this taking place, several members refer to him as Judas, and Colonel Onslow, who we've just heard about before, said that Judas Iscariot was a gentleman compared with the honourable member for Upper Hunter. He's taken to the chair amidst cries of Judas ringing out around him, and the new Speaker-elect finally leaves the chair at 7:29 a.m. on Thursday the 24th of August. The motion to elect the Speaker had commenced at 12:11 p.m, a day earlier on Wednesday the 23rd of August, nearly 20 hours to elect a Speaker into the chair. As a result of all of that, Willis polls 640 votes at the 1913 election, Cairn 3,149 and Abbott 3,803. So Cairn is defeated, but Willis is decimated. Cairn does get his chance a year later in 1904 at the by-election for Canterbury. It's caused by a bankruptcy of Henry Peters, and Cairn comfortably wins the nomination and then the seat. The other gentleman, Guy Arkins, we'll see on the screen here. He also contests a seat at the 1913 election, also unsuccessful. He's contesting the seat of Lyndhurst against Thomas Waddell, who's a former Premier. Waddell himself had been first elected for the Free Trade Party in 1897, so another stalwart. But Arkins had been born in 1897. So again, we're still seeing this generational sense of some long-standing members, whereas others are just coming through at a much later time. Arkins himself is born in Millthorpe in that year. His father had actually opened the very first store in Millthorpe back in the early days of the 1880s. And he worked at the Great Western Milling Company for about 6 years. He then goes into journalism, becomes quite involved with Labor Party politics in his early 20s, and the popularity of Larkin sees him nominated for that Lyndhurst seats that he is defeated in. He only loses by 182 votes, which against a former Premier is no mean feat. And he gains a reputation as a second Holman, this man who could one day become leader and Premier for his party. Fortunately for Arkins, there is another by-election a year later. The death of John Treflay gives an opportunity in the seat of Castlereagh. In the 1915 by-election, Arkins wins it quite comfortably, but he immediately faces accusations of being anti-war. It's 1915, the war has started, men have gone off to serve. Arkins himself is quite young, and he hasn't enlisted. He also faces claims that he is anti-recruitment. It's said in one newspaper that he had said a speech that was against recruitment, such to the point where he'd been asked to stop talking. But then he later actually wins a libel case against a few newspapers for their misleading claims as well. But with all that said and done, by the time both of these men come into the chamber, George Braund and Ted Larkin have already set sail for the front. A convoy of 48 Australian and New Zealand transports, about 30,000 soldiers, 12,000 horses, as well as some medical and military equipment, depart the west coast of Australia on the 1st of November 1914. They disembark at Alexandria on the 3rd of December of the same year, and it's a bit of a surprise to many of the soldiers to be in the deserts of Egypt. Many of them assume that they should be over in France fighting the Germans. There's a particularly large anti-German sentiment in Australia at the time. There's a lot of enlistment and propaganda saying, let's go and fight these Germans. Not many of them expect to be arriving in Egypt, but that's where they are. And it's in Egypt where the AIF and the New Zealand Expeditionary Force are formed into the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, ANZAC, as of course we now know it. It's commanded by the well-regarded Lieutenant General William Birdwood. In a largely Christian Australia at the time, again over 90% of the nation would have a Christian faith, at least nominally, the soldiers write home. They're quite fascinated to actually be standing in the lands where these stories had been told to them. The Pharaoh, the Moses, all of these things in Egypt, they are now there seeing the things that they have read about, and they write home continuously about this fascination too. As we'll see in the picture here, we do have some members of the 2nd Battalion, and if we look quite carefully, we'll see the man in the middle facing towards us is actually Lieutenant Colonel Braund. He has the opportunity to catch up with some fellow soldiers from Armidale while he's over there as well, who've joined the Light Horsemen. And the soldiers themselves train in the deserts of Egypt, under the shadow of the pyramids and the Sphinx. There's many fascinating photos of men just having their photo on a horse in front of the Sphinx, which historically is fascinating to see. Many of them refer back to Napoleon and his exploits a century before them in the same deserts as well. There's a couple of other reminders of home. A couple of soldiers from some different battalions have actually snuck aboard a koala and a kangaroo, and they become unofficial mascots of some of the Australian troops for the time. But one other reminder is this very poignant image that we'll see on the screen here. So we have Mr. Larkin, Mr. Braund, and also John Brady Nash as well. 3 parliamentarians have found each other over in Egypt. And the curious thing to me about this photo is that each of the men are wearing a different hat. So we see Sergeant Larkin, he's got the British service cap, which was issued to soldiers of the 1st Division, as well as a slouch hat. We've got Braund, who's actually sitting atop our noble steed here in the sun helmet, probably quite fitting for the Egyptian desert at the time as well. And Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Nash is wearing a slouch hat, that very iconic Australian headwear that we probably associate most with Anzac. But as I've said, it's soon to become a rather poignant image. Within a matter of months, 2 of these men will have died in active service. And that's where we get to our Gallipoli landing. Now again, I assume some background knowledge here. I'm sure we're all quite aware of the Gallipoli landing itself. I won't divulge great detail of it, but I will cover a couple of things here. Now the first troops to land at Gallipoli are the 9th, 10th, 11th and 12th Battalions of the 3rd Brigade. It's what the Australian military historian Charles Bean refers to as the outer states, being West Australia, South Australia, Tasmania and Queensland, basically everyone not New South Wales and Victoria. And Braund and Larkin, they come a bit later, a couple of hours later. They're both part of the 1st Brigade, which then lands. Sergeant Larkin is attached to the 1st Battalion, and they're directed onto Plateau 400. It's the scene of one of the most costly struggles of the day, and most men are of the belief that regardless of what happens, their objective is to just keep moving forward. Any plans to withdraw the advance and re-establish the line are fruitless, as some of the other battalions had already advanced further, so it's hard to establish any real line of defence. Another thing on top of that is that the Turkish counter-attack drove north of the plateau and were thrusting with ever-increasing numbers behind them as well, so there's this real sense of urgency and helplessness among some of the troops. There's a bit of confusion at the time. And between 11 o'clock in the morning and midday, it's said that a most deadly fire of mountain guns was opened on the Australians on Plateau 400. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Braund is with the 2nd Battalion. He's charged with leading many of them, and he's directed his men to scale what is known as Walker's Ridge to back up what is known as Baby 700, the numbers referring to the height from the ocean. They essentially track up goat tracks, and it takes them until 4 o'clock, but they do reach their goal. What's most difficult for Braund and his men is that it's said between about 12:30 and 4 p.m, not a single additional soldier lands on the beaches of Gallipoli. There is no one to back them up for many hours, so they do have to hunker down a little bit. Braund is unable to ascertain whether any battalions are around or nearby. The Turkish forces are in a position where they can actually attack both Plateau 400 and Baby 700 at the time. Braund receives no reply. He decides to take his men back instead of going out to danger. However, he happens to meet some reinforcements of the New Zealand Division on the way down. So instead, gets them all together, they go back up to the ridge and go back to their established position and hold in for the night. It's quite fierce fire, but they do hold in. Several attempts had been made to scale Baby 400 where the 1st Battalion were, largely unsuccessful. It's about 4 or 5 in the same day they try and scale at Baby 400, largely, unfortunately, unsuccessful. Now in the evening there's a few men of the 1st Battalion returning from one of those advances, and they discover what they describe as a savagely slashed body of an Australian soldier. And it's discovered to be Edward Rennix Larkin, the member for Willoughby. Quite tragically, Larkin was killed in that first advance. It's said that he developed quite a fine influence upon his battalion in the time prior to their departure for Gallipoli, and yet he now lay among the hundreds of dead Australians in their first 24 hours in what's often described as the baptism of fire for the Australian Imperial Forces. Rumours soon begin to circulate that Larkin's body had been mutilated by the Turkish soldiers. And due to the nature of fighting, it's actually hard to verify whether or not this is the case. In fact, although some of the soldiers have been able to identify Larkin, they have not been able to recover his body. So he can't collect it for quite some time. Night then falls on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the 25th of April. And fortunately for the Australians, it brings them a little bit of a reprieve. It means that both sides fighting are now on even footing. They can't see who they are shooting, so it means that the artillery guns are unable to be as accurate. And again, the war correspondent Charles Bean observes that only officers like the gallant Braund, lying out with their troops and with their fingers on the pulse of the front line, could realise this change. And there's such a change in spirits that it's said that at dusk there's far more anxiety on the beaches than up in the hills in the firing line of the soldiers, because they've understood that change, whereas those on the beaches haven't quite received that message. Now, after 3 days of continuous fighting, the 2nd Battalion are ordered to retire to the beach for a rest, being relieved by the New Zealand troops. For his efforts across these 3 days of fighting, Braund is mentioned in dispatches. The particulars note that he acted with gallantry and dash, advancing his position steadily and with judgment. He maintained his forward position with great courage until relieved on the 28th of April. So they do have a few days reprieve, but again, a few days later, they are back into action. The 1st of May, the 2nd Battalion head back up the hills and they return to the steep cliffs, one of which is now named Braund's Hill, after their wonderful Lieutenant Colonel. They go to assist further soldiers, fortify some trenches in that area. And a couple of days later at 1 a.m, there's a sentry noticing someone beyond the picket lines. Braund had drilled into his men so well that if there was anything suspicious, they were to call out, they were to be investigated. If there's nothing to be heard, they were to then be shot. Having heard no reply, the sentry fired on this figure, assuming it had been a Turkish soldier or something of the like. Instead, when morning came, the sentry wandered over to the body, finding that it was, in fact, Lieutenant Colonel George Frederick Braund, and he'd been shot through the head. The recently promoted Corporal Alwyn wrote that most of us wanted to shoot the sentry, or at least do him some bodily harm. But as we did not know who the sentry was, and it was explained to us that the Colonel was drifting in his sleep, we had to let it drop. We buried him. Most of us feel a bit off, a bit downhearted. In the same diary entry, Alwyn considered it hard luck for us. Just as we got to like him, we lose him. He was seen as a hard taskmaster, Lieutenant Colonel Braund, but certainly earned the respect of his men before his death. Alwyn also noted that Braund had been worrying too much lately with little or no sleep. Other accounts refer to Braund sometimes taking shortcuts between trenches as well. He was also in his late 40s, and other people say that he was partially deaf and may not have heard the call of the sentry at the time. So there is a bit of speculation around the exact details, but it's fair to say that he is shot by one of his own men. It takes 9 days for the news of George Braund's death to reach Australian shores. The public had already read the English correspondent Ellis Ashmead Bartlett's account of the landing, which was quite laudatory of the Australians, perhaps overplays the achievements of the Australians a little bit and downplaying the cost at which the landing had come. But it's a big deal for the Australians to get this kind of coverage in the British press as well. But at the time of the news, Premier Holman is hosting a Premier's Conference in the Legislative Council at the time. The Victorian Premier moves a resolution of sympathy, which is seconded by the South Australian Premier, and the House adjourns. In Armidale, every flag is flown at half-mast in the town centre, and his loss was greatly eulogised by the wider public. The Sydney Morning Herald wrote that had he chosen, he might have risen to a high place in the public life of the country, but he chose the better part. To lay down one's life for one's country is the highest and noblest form of public service. And 2 days later, on the 15th of May, Charles Bean, he has his account of the landing published in the Australian papers. The staff at British General Headquarters hadn't recognised Bean as Australia's official war correspondent, so it had been held up for quite some time, but it's eventually received. And Bean's account's a bit more authoritative than that of Ellis Ashmead Bartlett. Bean gets to the beach earlier than Bartlett. He sees a lot of things firsthand. And his account itself has gone on to contribute to what we would refer to as the Anzac legend. He makes reference as well to the element of rest. And there's quite a curious story as a part of that report where he says that for a time the beach in the midst of the fiercest battle ever fought in the Dardanelles looked more like Manly on a holiday. There's a report of the soldiers going to bathe in the water there, even despite shells flying over the top of them. And only one man is shot and killed, but that doesn't seem to deter many of the other soldiers from staying in the water and having a bit of a swim, quite curiously. Larkin's fate, though, at this time, even though he's been dead for a good 3 or 4 weeks, is not known by the wider Australian public. As late as the 10th of June, there's some newspapers still publishing letters from Ted Larkin referring to him as fit and well at the front. And in the 17th of June, we see the first confirmation of Larkin's death, nearly 2 months after he's in fact killed. His body is first recovered on the 24th of May during an armistice with the Turkish forces, and the wounds appear to have been caused by machine gun bullets, which quell any real belief of mutilation that had been circulating before. But it's not quite well known enough by everyone. Those rumours still persist that Larkin has been mutilated. They see the Turkish soldiers as barbarians, but it's not quite the case at the time. Premier Holman immediately again adjourns the Parliament upon hearing this news, and Ted's brother, Martin Joseph Larkin, Paddy Larkin, is found to have tragically died on the exact same day, the 25th of April. So 2 of Ms. Larkin's sons are tragically killed. And I noted here that in many ways the soldiers die twice. They have their actual earthly death, but then there's also another death when the news reaches home, sometimes a month, sometimes a year. It takes time for that news to come across, and they die almost a second time once the people hear of that news as well. But of course, as we know of Gallipoli, the campaign itself is largely unsuccessful. The retreat from Gallipoli is often considered the most successful element of the campaign, for 2 reasons. One, of course, being the drip rifle, and the second being a cricket match. Now, I mention this for 2 reasons. One being that I really love cricket, but second, that the person that organises it is Major George MacArthur Onslow, who is the brother of James MacArthur Onslow, the member for Bondi. There's some general consensus among historians that he's also the one batting in this image as well. Again, largely a piece of propaganda. The match itself lasts 5 or 6 minutes before they're shelled at the time, but again, it shows the Turkish soldiers that maybe the Australians are sticking around, when in reality they are looking to evacuate the peninsula. Beyond that, at the end of this campaign itself, as news reaches home of the deaths of Braund and Larkin, we see more members of this Assembly chamber enlisting for active service. The first 3 are Chaffey, Fern and Onslow, and particularly for Chaffey here that we see on the screen, the sacrifices of Braund and Larkin had left a rather indelible mark on Frank Chaffey. Chaffey, of course, the member for Tamworth, nearby is Armidale, of which George Braund had represented, so he feels this quite strongly, this need to enlist. When he rises to speak in the chamber, he makes reference to what the Speaker himself had said in sending off Braund and Larkin. He said that when the late Colonel Braund was going to the front, the Speaker made the solemn promise that he would do his utmost for the people Mr. Braund represented. He had now been relieved of that responsibility. The young men who were physically fit and had no responsibilities should come forward and offer themselves for service at the front. So Chaffey does enlist. We see him resplendent in his uniform here as well. But at the same time, Charles Fern also enlists. Now, I mentioned before that in his mining exploits, Charles Fern had contracted tuberculosis. Fern hides that from the military people as he does enlist, because otherwise they would not accept him as a soldier. And it's said by some reports that he enlists in the Sportsman's Company. I haven't been able to verify that fully yet, but there is some inclination of that. And third, of course, is Colonel Onslow. He's quite old, he'd be at least in his 50s, but he still wants to assist with the war effort. He ends up with the transport troops, helping the soldiers from Sydney out over to Egypt as well. On top of that, we get to the end of September. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholson, the Boer War veteran who I mentioned before, he is 61 years old. And yet he decides to retire from the military in February of 1914. So 4 months before the war broke out, he retired, and yet he's back in action after 26 years of service. But similarly to Onslow, he is with those transport ships as well, going back and forth from the front. It's interesting to read about Nicholson's farewell from this chamber. Both sides of the chamber, the Speaker, anyone in attendance, is very laudatory of Charles Edward Nicholson. He's in fact humbled to receive such a departure from the Assembly. It's quite unexpected at the time, but such was the esteem in which he was held by his peers. But on the screen here, we see another member who leaves slightly later than those three men, Thomas Henley. And it's in a slightly different capacity. It's not in a fighting capacity. He assists with the Salvation Army, the Australian Red Cross, I should say, and in particular the Citizens War Chest Fund. So although the war is going on, there is a need to supply those men with different things, whether it's gifts from home, it could be the socks, it could be the other food to get to the front as well. It's a largely administrative task, but he goes to Egypt to work in this capacity. In his own words, when he's leaving the chamber, Henley says that he will act in the capacity of Father Christmas to the Australian troops. Even around Christmas time, he goes out giving hampers sent from home to the Australian troops, which largely cheers them up. In the image to this left, I think it's a brilliant image. It's his son, Harold Leslie Henley, who was also enlisted for service, pictured with his father in front of the Sphinx and the pyramid. Harold tragically dies fighting in the war a couple of years later in 1916. And the image on the right here is a recruiting meeting where Thomas Henley is speaking to a large crowd, encouraging them to enlist for active service. But perhaps the most ambitious of the members is this man here, Ambrose Campbell Carmichael. He sets himself the target of recruiting an entire battalion, 1,000 men, from the Rifle Rangers of Sydney. He is largely successful in this. By the end of 1915, it's said that 30 to 40 men are enlisting each day to be part of Carmichael's 1,000, as it becomes known. And it ends up being the 36th Battalion. He raises the 1,000 men. They go off and fight and see action on the Western Front by 1917. There's even a song that is written for his efforts, Captain Carr Goes to War, and another program is put for this farewell concert for him in 1915. And yet by the end of the year, there's this very strange occurrence. Although the members, Braund and Larkin, they have died, there's this really awkward, uncomfortable element that we do have to elect 2 new members to the Parliament, to the Legislative Assembly. One of these is very easy. The by-election for Armidale is as simple as the Liberal Reform Party nominates their candidate, they win, Labor does not hold a candidate, so there is no by-election. The Liberal Reform candidate gets the seat of Armidale. Unfortunately, that is not the case in Willoughby, and it becomes rather controversial. The Liberal Reform Party under Charles Wade, they do not run a candidate in this election, but there are 6 candidates that run for election at the Willoughby by-election. Premier Holman is very unpleased, as you can imagine. He has not run one of his own party members in Armidale. He expects the same courtesy and response. He appreciates, though, that it is not Charles Wade, the leader of the opposition's fault. He has made statements against that. As a result of this, again, a fairly anti-German sentiment that we see, this Cheers for the Kaiser incident. We can read the headline there. After this vote, we have to go to what is known as a second ballot. So if no one wins more than 50% of the vote at the time, if it's somewhat close, the 2 leading candidates will then have to be voted again a week later. So the Labor candidate is in the lead, John Chambers, after that time. That's right. All good. Thanks for coming. We get to this second week, Labor candidate ahead, but with the 4 members who were more sympathetic to the Liberal cause away, everyone can now vote for the one candidate instead of spreading their vote across 5 separate candidates. So as a result, we see John Chambers, the Labor candidate, lose to John Haynes, who runs as an independent Democrat. Slightly interesting about Haynes is that he'd earlier established the Bulletin newspaper, some of you may have heard of, with Jules Archibald, Archibald being of Archibald Prize fame. But he wins this, is somewhat rather controversial figure. He's happy to be divisive within the Parliament. He says he goes in as the truly only independent member because everyone else is with party. He can say what he wants and cause a bit of mischief. But yeah, Premier Holman is not happy with the outcome of this by-election. But despite all of this animosity between everyone, we then get to a rather poignant matter to end off 1915, and that is the unveiling of a memorial plaque for George Braund and Ted Larkin. This takes place on the 30th of November 1915, so we're only a couple of weeks away from the actual 110th anniversary of that occurrence. The occasion sees speeches from the Premier, from the former Premier Thomas Waddell as well, on behalf of the absent opposition leader Charles Waite, as well as the Speaker, who we heard some notes from our current Speaker as well. The memorial plaque that we can actually see adorning our chamber currently was, it had been covered by the British blue ensign flag. It had been drawn aside by the Speaker. And we have this rather iconic image that some of you may have even seen in the advertising for this event, but I found it's important. Let's have a little bit of a closer look to what's going on in this particular image. So of course we can see this plaque itself. On the left is the portrait of William Charles Wentworth. What you cannot see is that earlier on the right hand side there was actually a portrait of Sir Henry Parkes in the chamber. So the plaque we have was splitting those two portraits. If we look a bit further down, we'll see the Speaker there in his full bottom wig, Speaker Meagher, the Premier Holman, and again Thomas Waddell, that former Premier, acting on behalf of the opposition leader. We can also see in the middle there, this is Frank Chaffey in his uniform. So he is enlisted, however he has been able to come to the unveiling of this particular memorial. I don't think it is, but the gentleman to his right looks a bit like a former Prime Minister, Bob Menzies, I think, but it could be wrong. And then to the right of him looks a bit like our Deputy Sergeant-at-Arms, Todd Buttsworth, as well, but I digress. Moving a bit further along, the gentleman in the moustache here, I believe, is George Cairn, again, member for Canterbury. Over here we see a few different members. The gentleman in his uniform, that is Charles Fern, who again had recently enlisted. To his right, the gentleman looking a bit forlorn towards the ground, that is Guy Arkins. If we follow his gaze down there, the gentleman with the moustache, I believe, is Jack Lang, who goes on to become the Premier, rather divisive figure in and of himself. And you might see a gentleman sort of looking towards or away from the screen. Just to his left, I think, is Billy Dunn. Again, it's hard to tell with some of the lighting, but it seems to be him as well. If we look upwards, this historically was the ladies' gallery, so we see the women with all their hats adorning as well. I believe we see the widows Larkin and Braund sitting up here as well. And you might see a child just to the left of screen. It's hard to verify because we can only see the hair, but I believe it to be one of the sons of Ted Larkin. He had two very young sons who tragically were left behind with this. Braund had some older sons in their teenage years as well, but again, the tragic reminder of war is that as much as these men sacrifice, there is much left behind as well, rather sadly. And if we move along to the back here, our press gallery, it's curious to me just because of what's on the right-hand side. We see our Hansard gallery on the same level as the press gallery at the time, however now it's been lowered down to a ground floor as well, but it's a slightly different chamber that we see. But the event itself, this unveiling of the memorial plaque, Chopin's funeral march is played by a military band, all in attendance stand in silence. It's then followed by Onward Christian Soldiers, a very popular hymn of its time, and it concludes with a rendition of God Save the King from all in attendance. The House then adjourns until later that evening before continuing on with the business of the day. But if I just direct your attention towards the plaque itself on the wall, and the text of it's also in those booklets that you'll have, but you'll note that it says that these men fell in the Great War gloriously in action at the Dardanelles in the month of May 1915. Now, this is certainly true of George Braund, who's killed in the early days of May, but Ted Larkin almost certainly is killed on the 25th of April 1915. At the time, of course, it takes time for this news to reach Australian shores. It's placed in within a matter of months. Some believe because his body was retrieved in May, perhaps that's why he's placed up there as well, but it is important to perhaps point out that although important, it's maybe not entirely accurate to the exact death dates, but still a fascinating memorial nonetheless. To conclude things, I just want to obviously say there's plenty much more to say, and perhaps, if I'm very lucky, we can have another one next year about the conscription referendums, but might be asking too much. I want to thank you all for your attendance here this afternoon and for your understanding in a few of the tangents I've taken. It's, again, a great honour to be standing here in this historic chamber to discuss something that I've found quite interesting, and I hope you have as well. So thank you.